mental health services, assistance with getting access to legal assistance, etc. The second pronged approach is our training and technical assistance. So we're helping our communities navigate through the various systems, but we also want to ensure that the systems are aware of the challenges and barriers that our communities are facing, ways they could be more affirming and address some of those issues. So we provide trainings to law enforcement, court personnel, health and human service agencies, medical settings, SANE nurses, on issues impacting our communities. We also provide educational presentations to colleges and universities and to community members as well. The third prong is our systems level advocacy. So we're working with individuals, we're working with communities and organizations, but we also want to make sure that we are working with individuals who have the power of the pen, as we call it, those who can make legislative changes, policy changes, and other changes on a systems level, because we know at times individuals may get it, they may want to be inclusive, they may want to learn, organizations may get it, but if the policy makers aren't getting it or it's not in policy or protocol, it's not going to be as impactful as it could be. So that's kind of our three-pronged approach to service provision, and we do that with a lot of a variety of programs and services that you can find on our website, which is www.inourownvoices.org.
So now we're going to take a moment to see who's in the room. So in our beautiful chat box that we have that's located at the left side of your screen, if you can type in your location, what organization you're from, and what field and profession that you're currently in. So we're going to take about 3 minutes to do that now. So if you can type in a chat box your location, organization, and the field and profession that you're currently in.
So we have individuals joining us from Long Island, Albany County Crime Victim Sexual Violence Center, Mental Health Empowerment Project in Albany, New York. We have college counseling centers from the College of St. Rose in Albany, New York. We have Owego, New York, a New Hope Center. We have Restore in Rochester, Long Island Against Domestic Violence. We have another individual joining us from Albany County Crime Victims and Sexual Violence Center. Also Owego, a New Hope Center. In New York, RSS Probation Department. Oneonta, New York, A.O. Fox Hospital, and ERRN. Also from Oneonta, Opportunities for Oswego Violence Intervention Program. St. Peter's Health Partners in Albany, New York. So we do have a variety of individuals joining us from various areas in the state of New York, so that is good to hear and see. And I also know that some individuals are joining us collectively, so a number of people at the same workstation or computer. So thank you for providing that information to us.
Okay, so our objectives for today, we're hoping that you'll take away, we'll be able to provide you with context to better understand the transgender community, also understand risk factors and unique issues faced by transgender survivors and also victims. And last but not least, we'd like to engage participants on community-based solutions, solutions to create safe spaces for transgender victims and survivors.
And we would be remiss if we did not state that this is a short amount of time that we have together. We will not be, it won't be a overall comprehensive, you sit with us for the next, hour or so, and you're going to walk away an expert. This is just to lay the foundation, to get conversation started, to identify areas which you may not have been familiar with, and also to enhance you in the areas where you may have already had some expertise. We also want to rely on, as you see with the third objective, is community-based solutions. So there may be things that participants on the webinar are already doing that's working, that they can rely on the expertise of your colleagues and other people doing the work as well. So we like to start every training that we facilitate in our own voices, making sure we're all on the same page as it relates to language. And we talk about language as being a very powerful tool. Language has the power to heal, and it also has the power to hurt and re-victimize individuals. So when we're working with marginalized groups that already face barriers and challenges, it's very important to have a foundational language in how you are working with and interacting with individuals. So this presentation is working with the transgender community. So it's important to know that transgender is not a sexual orientation, and people oftentimes get it confused, and I know it's in the LGBT acronym that may lead to that confusion, but transgender is a gender identity, and sexual orientation is referring to someone's spiritual, emotional, and physical attraction. So we're going to spend some time going over basic sexual orientation definitions and then move on to gender identity. And it's important that we note that we observe the term sexual orientation. Many people have stated in a lot of trainings and people we interact with sexual preference, and we kind of shy away from that as it aligns sexual orientation as being voluntary choice and not an innate trait, an innate part of who we are. So we try not to use the term sexual preference as it denotes that we have a choice in the matter. And we also want to make sure that we unpack sexual orientation to go beyond sex. When people talk about sexual orientation or LGBT communities, many people automatically go to who the person is sleeping with. And sexual orientation is more than that. We include spiritual attraction, emotional, and physical attraction in our definition of sexual orientation. Everyone has a sexual orientation. It's nothing unique to LGBT individuals. So we want to make sure that everyone has consistent language around sexual orientation. So some of the basic sexual orientation terms we have are lesbian, a woman or girl whose primary sexual, romantic, or spiritual feelings are for people of the same sex.
Bisexual, a person whose sexual, romantic, or spiritual feeling may be for people of either sex. Then we have gay, a man or boy whose primary sexual, romantic, and spiritual feelings are for people of the same sex. Then we have those good old asexual individuals, a person who is not interested in or does not desire sexual activity either within or outside a relationship. Not the same as celibacy, which will be the willful decision not to act on sexual feelings.
And while not physically sexual, we just want to make sure that people are aware that asexual individuals are still capable of loving, affectionate, romantic ties with others. It's just the sexual component where asexual individuals are not active. So we wanted to make sure we provided that clarity as well. Then we have heterosexual, an individual whose primary sexual, romantic, or spiritual feelings are for people of the opposite sex. Homosexual, formerly used to refer to any person whose sexual and romantic feelings are for people of the same sex. And we say formerly used because it did not originate from the community, and it also was listed as a form of mental illness. But we do know some individuals who are part of the LGBT community who identify as homosexual. We're just saying that there's been a movement to kind of shift the language around that, but we don't want to take away the power of individuals to self-identify and to self-disclose as well. And then the next term that we have is queer. It is an inclusive term which refers collectively to lesbian, gay men, bisexual, and transgender people, and others who may not identify with the term. Queer, and this is important as well, and those of you, I know some people are joining us who have been to other trainings from In Our Own Voices. Queer is a tricky term, and this goes to the power of self-identification because we have many people in the LGBT community who will not associate with the term queer because of the history. It's about knowing history. queer originally was not meant in an empowering, inclusive way. It meant strange, other, different, less than. Individuals who were quote-unquote queer were often subjected to verbal and or physical harassment and taunts. So it has an oppressive history, similar to the word nigga in people of color communities. You have some segments of the people of color community who have chosen to reclaim that word, to become empowered by it, to determine who can and cannot use it, to kind of take away the power from the oppressor. But you have many people of color who do not associate with that word and will not. It's similar to the word queer, where people will not, there's many people who will and many people who won't. So we rely on the individual's power to self-identify, and we mirror the language of the individual. It's not on us to say, well, why are you identifying with queer? Because don't you know where that word came from? Like, it's not our place to place judgment on anyone's identity and how they choose to see themselves. So those are some basic sexual orientation terms, and as I mentioned, there's a difference between your sexual orientation and your gender identity. So we're going to move on with some sex and gender terms.
Okay, and one of our first definition is sex. Sex is used to categorize people at birth into male or female or intersex based on physical characteristics such as anatomy, chromosomes, and hormones. Okay, and also what's not up there is intersex individuals. Intersex individuals are born with reproductive and sexual anatomy and or chromosome patterns that does not typically fit descriptions of male or female.
So with intersex, we like to pause on this term because, and I'll ask the question if people can type in, how many people have seen intersex on any forms? When you go to the doctor, when you're applying for loans or credit cards and they give you the form to check your sex, how many individuals have seen intersex as an option? If you can just type, okay, some people said, I have seen other, but never intersex specifically. Nope, we have it on our intake form for our agency though, which is great. Alan says no. Okay. Has anyone, other than those who have it on their agency forms, someone says never, and I'm over 60 years old. That's real. And one of the things, we like to unpack that. We talk about our society and how it's structured, and we've been structured in a very rigid, binary way. Male, female, black, white, gay, straight. And life does not work that way. We exist on a spectrum and on a continuum. So when you structure things in such a rigid, binary way, it can oftentimes be problematic. Intersex births are not uncommon. They say estimate 1 in 100 births are intersex, and that does not always have to do with your outward genitalia. It also can do with your hormones and chromosomes, but 1 in 100. So why isn't it more common? If you think of the hundreds of thousands of individuals who are born in a given day, why is it not common to see intersex on forms, to recognize the existence of something that falls outside of the male or female? And that kind of what we're talking about, the binary. And if you don't fall in that, something needs to happen. So oftentimes, doctors may and or parents, with or without parental consent, or sometimes with parental consent, are making decisions to which sex this child or that is born will be raised as. Sometimes there's corrective, quote-unquote, corrective surgery done at birth or into early childhood to kind of push the child into a box and force them to be identifying in a way that may not show up later on. So you may have an individual who's born intersex, and the doctor and her parents might say, oh, well, this genitalia seems more pronounced, or they look more like this sex, so let's make that correction. And then they grow up, and it's totally different. So Sarah may be raised as a girl, and as she begins to grow up, she's not developing breasts, she's developing more muscle mass, hair, voice getting deeper and exhibiting more masculine traits and characteristics, and to what we talk about what that psychological impact and the stress that leaves for a person. So it's problematic to exist in this structure, this rigid, structured way. And I know there has been legislation that has been going on for years, but I've heard that it's been gaining traction in the last year or so to ban this practice federally and on local and state levels, and to allow the existence of intersex bodies. But we like to press pause on that because it's a very clear example of the problem when we live in such a society that is such clear-cut, binary, black or white society, because it erases individuals' identities and it pushes them into closets and other distressing situations. So the next term we have is gender identity.
Okay. As you said earlier, transgender and identity. This is exactly will be a good place for that. An individual's internal sense of being male or female or something outside of these binaries, which may or may not correspond with the person's body or assigned sex at birth. Our gender role is a collection of society assumptions, expectations, and traditions for how a person of a particular gender is supposed to act and or be treated by others.
And once again, we say this is a collection of society's assumptions, expectations, and traditions. That is social construct. That is that binary that we've spoken about that can be at times problematic. Society has, in the past, said, females can only get jobs in certain professions. You're seeing female nurses, seeing female teachers, males as well. There's still ongoing jokes about, male nurses, as if it's less than for a man to be a nurse. The clothing that we wear, some of the professions that we get in, as I mentioned before, are oftentimes gendered. You see even with children's toys, the Easy Bake Oven. I'm not sure how many people had Easy Bake Ovens growing up, but now they're like, let's develop stainless steel looking Easy Bake Ovens so men will be interested, little boys will be interested in baking, and we'll do pink ovens for the girls. So we're looking at these social constructs and how they kind of push individuals into boxes, and when individuals fall outside of expected gender roles, what generally happens? What we see is increasing harassment, bullying, individuals being made to feel less than. A sensitive young man or a sensitive boy is often told to man up. Boys don't cry, those catchphrases that you constantly hear, to kind of force them into behaviors. And then when we look later in life and they say, why are certain men so aggressive and assertive or not sensitive? And it's like, that's how we've been brought up. That's how our culture has depicted how men should behave. So being aware of that when we look at gender roles, and also saying if these things can be constructed, they can also be deconstructed as they do shift and change over time.
And sex and gender continued. Sexual expression is how one communicates their gender. This may include behavior, dress, mannerisms, speech patterns, and social interactions. And as we're speaking about being trans, we'll talk about the 3 ways in which you can transition that will fall into line with gender expression. Cisgendered, a person whose gender identity matches their assigned sex and gender at birth.
So cis generally means one. Cis means one, and trans means across. So generally, anyone who does not identify as transgender is recognized as cisgender. These terms are, for some, confusing. They are relatively, or at least with cisgender, is a relatively new term. It wasn't birthed out of the community. You may not hear a lot of LGBT individuals saying, I am the cisgender male or cisgender female. It's starting to pick up, but these terms were birthed out of the movement. So whether that's activism, whether that's in school, colleges, universities, these terms have very academic in their origins, but are starting to pick up in non-secular sections as well.
Transgender, a person whose gender identity and or expression does not match the expected gender or norm typically associated with their assigned sex and gender at birth. Transgender, once again, as we stated earlier, is not a sexual orientation, however, it is a gender identity.
Right, so people find it confusing when we say that, and saying that transgender individuals can be heterosexual, they can be bisexual, they can be lesbian, they can be gay, they can be pansexual, they can fall in any area of the sexual orientation spectrum because it is a gender identity. It's how one sees themselves and how they psychologically identify, not who they are attracted to.
And continuing talking about gender identities, transgender is an umbrella term. There's many identities that fall within under the umbrella of transgender. Most familiar is F to M, which is female to male. We also have M to F, which is male to female. We have butch, femme, transsexual, pre-op, non-op, gender bender, trans man and trans woman. We have gender outlaw, and commonly known drag queens and drag queens. Third gender individuals, cross-dressers, and then at the bottom of that we'll have intersex. And these are all ways in which you can choose to express yourself and have an identity with a gender expression that kind of matches that.
Also, we have, which we didn't include, was two-spirited as well. Many of our Native brothers and sisters some identify as two-spirit individuals, which means they embody the components and the power and strength of both sexes and genders. So it's important to recognize cultural differences because in those cultures, and also cultures in parts of Asia and South America, individuals who identify as transgender or two-spirit or third gender are oftentimes the ones that are seen as, wise, and they're revered in the community, and people go to them for blessings and advice and things like that. So it is very important to recognize the cultural connotations of these identities as well. So as you see on the screen right now, we have the genderbread person, which is basically a cute little infographic that sums up all of the definitions that we just gave you in the previous two slides. So when you look at your gender identity is your brain, how you in your head think about yourself. The sexual orientation is your heart, who you are physically, spiritually, romantically attracted to and responsive to. You have your sex, the sex assigned at birth, and you see that depicted. And then your gender expression is your outward sense of expression, how you present yourself to the world, how you act, behave, dress, etc. So we wanted just to provide a very simple and colorful, infographic that you can utilize maybe in your own work.
And everyone, whether you're gay or straight, is able to map yourself out. And a lot of times in trainings, we have individuals come up and map themselves out. Some people are straight up and down, and then some people, the gender-bred person is like a zigzag. For instance, the person can be born, their gender identity is a woman, their gender expression is androgynous, their biological sex can be female, and their sexual orientation can be bisexual. As you can see, that's a zigzag. It's not straight up and down, and gay and straight people all have all of these four components: gender identity, gender expression, biological sex, and sexual orientation.
So we are talking about working with the transgender community, and we gave some examples of the difference between sexual orientation and gender identity. So those who identify as transgender, some of them may choose to do something that we call transitioning. So there's transitioning from one sex or gender to another to become more in alignment with how they feel. So there are typically three ways in which a trans individual can transition. Can people in the chat box type in one way they believe a transgender individual can transition? Like I said, there's three main ways. So someone says physically. Anyone else want to take a guess, or if you know? Someone also says socially. Someone says hormonally, surgically, changing their name / self-identification. All correct. Legally, yes. Clothing. So we're mixing up, we're trying to blending the ways in which someone can transition and then the means in which people can transition. So all of you are absolutely correct, and we're going to go into the 3 ways right now.
So our first way in which a transgender person usually starts their transitioning is by social transition. And what that means generally is like Sally will now go by a different name. So hello, my name is Paul. So a person will change their name, and they'll change their name with their employers. They'll change their name with coworkers, with close family and friends, to kind of sort of to match the identity in which they're currently presenting. Also, with a social transition, people begin to change their appearance. And so this is where you get cross-dressing kind of placed into part. So male-identified people would begin to, dress in what we deem to be female clothing, and vice versa. Females will begin to dress in, adorn themselves in what we call male clothing. And then you also have gender non-conforming individuals. Those are people that like to gender blend. And so you can kind of one day is this and the next day is that, which is nothing wrong with that because they're just gender fluid. And then people will come out, like I said, to their families and friends, and to their coworkers, and into their employer. That's some ways in which you'll see people socially transitioning and also beginning to frequent different social places in which they go out to hang out in.
And it's also important to recognize that with social transition, the same way with sexual orientation, you may be out, quote unquote, out in certain circles and not in others. So you may have individuals who identify as trans and with their friends and not their employers. They may be with their friends and employers and not their family. It depends on safety, comfortability, and other factors. Other ways that individuals may socially transition, as Lamia was mentioning with their appearance, is we may have individuals who, so a female to male trans individual may bind their chest. They may bind it with materials that reduce the look of and appearance of breasts. They may bind it with bandages, with other mechanisms to minimize the look of breasts without having surgery. And there's also chest plates and breastplates that individuals who are male to female may wear as well to give the appearance of breasts without having to medically alter themselves. So that is some ways that individuals may socially transition. The second way is through legal transitioning.
And legal transitioning looks like getting your first starting off with applying for a name change, which usually is something that's affordable and reasonable. We in the state of New York, we have great lawyers that are able to help us, transgender individuals, to make that legal transition. So you start off with your name and getting your ID changed, and then you'll go on to getting your Social Security card changed and your birth certificate. The great thing about New York State is that a couple of years ago they passed a law that without having your sexual reassignment surgery, you can have your birth certificate changed to match your your identity that you identify as, which is so great because that prevents and helps people not to be discriminated against in situations in which it matters. And also as it relates to legal transitioning, not only these 3 documents will be changed, but also like bank accounts. We also have an opportunity to get educational records changed to match everything that you currently have, and also credit cards will be able to be changed. And also another great thing about transitional legally, and which also is another safety measure, in the state of New York, the judges have an option to seal the case, meaning that if you are a transgender individual and you go through the legal process, that your case will be sealed and no one will be able to know of your past identity. That will be sealed to the courts and to the courts only. So that kind of gives you an equal playing field if you're transitioning from one gender to another, and you don't have to worry about outing yourself, because a lot of people, when they do make the legal transition, a lot of trans individuals choose to live a self life. And when I say self, that's when they choose to live the life of the gender that they're perceived as, and they have passing privilege that they're able to do that.
And it's important to realize that Lamia is mentioning that all of the benefits that we have right now for some individuals in New York State, but also recognizing that that's not true for all individuals in New York State. It all depends on, where you're from, if you're aware of the resources and laws that are resources that are available to you, with some of the laws that Lamia mentioned. And also for some, it is a costly endeavor and a timely endeavor. And when you're dealing with workers or staff or individuals who may have biases against you for your identity, we often see resistance from individuals. And that resistance, they may not legally be able to prohibit you from doing these things, but the way that they treat you and talk to you and are condescending have presented some challenges that prevented some individuals from going through all of the legal options as well.
And when it comes to legal transitioning, all these three things you don't have to do all in one. They all kind of work together. But just to give a little bit more insight on some barriers, I still say that some people may face, getting your name changed is not a service that is free. You do have to pay for that. And generally speaking, the average fee is between $100 to $500. Varies on the court fees. Something else that you have to worry about is getting a court order petition. And if you're not able, if the judge does not seal your record, you do have to pay a publishing fee to have your name published in a newspaper, and that is the cost. But there are, with like the Legal Aid Society, transgender individuals are able to access their services. And if they fall within a certain income bracket, they're able to receive these services for free. Also, when it comes to some people change their name but don't change their gender, and that's personal reasoning, and for whatever reason they do that. But also, we're able now to provide letters. As I said, you can get your gender marker changed without having the sexual reassignment surgery, and that's by going to your physician. The physician will provide you a letter. You no longer have to have this, what used to be called a standard of care, meaning that you had to see a psychiatrist for 1 year, you had to be with your endocrinologist for 1 year in order to make these changes. We're now in a place that if a person identifies, you can give a consent saying who you are, and you're able to bypass what they call the Harry Benjamin law, meaning that you had to live in your perceived and chosen identity for 1 year. You no longer have to do that to be able to transition socially or legally and even medically now. So we have come really far as it relates to helping transgender individuals be comfortable in the skin that they're in and be respected.
Okay, then the third way that individuals may choose to transition is medically. I know that was someone mentioned, surgically, hormonally, etc. And these are we have images of individuals who have transitioned medically, male to female and female to male, through hormones, through surgery, etc. There are other ways that individuals can medically transition that does not involve genital reassignment surgery. They may be hormone replacement therapy. It may be getting your Adam's apple shaved down, or facial reconstructive surgery to soften the features of your face, or to give more rigid, defined features of your face. Are there any other you want to add to the medical transitioning piece?
As we talked about the medical, one of the great things, and what a lot of people are most familiar with, is the hormone replacement therapy, and that looks pretty similar between trans male and a trans woman. As it relates to a trans woman, when she starts her hormone therapy, she will be put on an estrogen regimen, and that will be estrogen pills or estradiol vibrate, which is injectable. Those come in 3 doses. which is 10 milligrams, 20 milligrams, and then 40. Then also for trans women, they will get a testosterone blocker called spirolactone, and that decreases the amount of testosterone that a trans person has in their body to help them as they make the decision whether or not if they want to have reassignment surgery or not. Being transgender, the surgery, you're still trans whether you have the surgery or not. When we talk about numbers for a trans woman to have that surgery, we're looking between $7,000 to $24,000, and that's just a rough average. As it relates to a trans male, when they begin their hormone replacement therapy, they go on testosterone, and that's between 100 milligrams and 400 milligrams, and they will give themselves the testosterone shot 2 to 4 times a week of testosterone. And as it relates to the surgery for trans men, which is something that's relatively new, but has had some great outcomes, the surgery for that is $50,000 and upwards as it relates to having a sexual reassignment for trans men. And that's just a little bit of information as it relates to the cost and some additional medical information as it relates to transitioning.
And many trans individuals are, and we'll get to a little bit of the barriers later, looking at some of the social and economic barriers faced by the community. So some people are saying, oh, why don't they just get the surgery? Why don't they transition? Some people can't afford it. They can't afford the legal transitioning. They can't afford the medical transitioning. Some insurance companies still see it as an elective. That's something that people just want to do just because, and not looking at it as something that is crucial to some members of the trans community's identity and sense of being whole. So they will not cover it. Some areas do provide coverage. In some areas they may cover hormones, but they may not cover some of the necessary surgeries. So being aware of that and looking at that impact on individuals who may be distressed because their physical is not in alignment with their psychological. So just to be mindful of some of the challenges that individuals of trans experience may have. And one of the things that had been common, and it's still happening, is trans individuals who cannot afford to go through this process resorting to in-house, peer-to-peer medical interventions, which are not always safe or healthy. So that may mean the term was coined, quote unquote, pump parties, where a group of trans men and women may get together on a certain night and they will inject themselves with, silicone and other objects to, soften their features, to plump their lips, to give themselves higher cheekbones, to get the curves and the curves that they want to see in their body, to enhance and increase their buttocks or their breasts, and those options are not safe. Many of them are not legal. They're black market testosterone and estrogen that has not been medically cleared. They're sharing needles, which puts them at risk for hepatitis and other types of transmittable viruses and diseases. And it also leads to health problems because some of the objects are not medical grade. So that's like some people going to, Home Depot and getting fillers of silicone or other things thinking it's the same as what a doctor is injecting in your body. And that has led to serious negative health outcomes, including cancers, death, the materials, foreign substances in their body lumping together and finding themselves in the body, and other negative outcomes. And some individuals are aware of the risk and will still engage because they have they have no other recourse, and that is the way that the risk they're willing to take so that they can be their authentic selves and be in alignment with how they identify. So we're going to transition, no pun intended, to our next area of the presentation, which is looking at violence that as it impacts trans individuals and some other areas of topics that we're going to talk about. So right now we're going to start with the quiz, and if you can put in the chat box whether you think the answer is A, B, C, or D. The question is, it is estimated that blank and blank transgender individuals will experience sexual violence in their lifetime. So we have two B's, two A's, another A, B, B, A, C, A. So right now, the predominant responses are A or A and B, which is saying 1 and 2 or 1 and 3. So the correct answer is A. Greater than 50% of trans individuals have or will experience sexual violence in their lifetime. This is snapshots from various reporting sources. Nearly 1 in 3 transgender people experience violence motivated by hate.
In 2017, already this year have been reported 27 homicides of transgender or gender nonconforming people, 85% of whom were people of color. In New York State alone this year, we had 3 trans women that were murdered, and out of the 3, 100% were of color.
And these are the ones that are reported. This is one of the deadliest years on record since they started recording trans-identified homicides. And the number is expected to be way higher. What we see is oftentimes trans individuals who have been murdered because of their identity, they're often misgendered by law enforcement and by the family. The family did not accept them as a trans person, so all of the reports, the funerals, the public outcry are referring to them as the name that they were given at birth and not how they identify, or the gender that they were assigned at birth and not how they identify. You have, trans individuals who live their life as, the sex or gender that they identified as, and then when they're being buried as the gender they were assigned at birth. So you're raised and you're living your life as Lisa for, 20, 30 years. You're senselessly murdered because of your identity, and then family or other individuals are burying you as Larry, which is distressful for everyone that knew Lisa as Lisa. So it's looking at some of those challenges that we see and how do we address them. And I'll say that for Albany, which is the county that we're from, has been working with In Our Own Voices for a number of years to make sure that they are trans inclusive, that they're shifting their policies to be more trans affirming and inclusive, and also when they're recognizing trans individuals, whether they are victims or alleged perpetrators, that they're giving them the correct gender and how they identify. So that is one of the benefits we have here, and that's due in part to the advocacy of our trans community here, as well as the work of In Our Own Voices to make that happen. So we mentioned a snapshot of some of the ways violence, especially sexual violence, impact trans individuals. So we know that there are many barriers to seeking safety and support for trans individuals. So can you all type in, what do you see as some potential barriers for transgender victims or survivors of sexual assault to seeking safety and support? Thank you, Alan. We see fear of judgment, fear of coming forward because they are afraid they will be judged, not sure if the agency is trans-friendly, transphobia in general, fear of disbelief, victim blaming, isolation, religious belief, being misidentified as primary aggressor in DV situations, being outed as trans, Awesome. You all are on a roll. These are very much some of the common responses we've seen from our community members who have accessed our services, not wanting to access services with law enforcement or first responders. The fear of judgment is a huge, huge one. The being misidentified as primary aggressor in a DV situation, that is correct, and it's also correct in sexual assault situations. We have individuals say, responders saying, okay, well, you're really a man anyway, so why couldn't you defend yourself against this individual who forced themselves on you? You know, you're a man. No matter how you identify, you're still a man. You were born a man, so you should have been able to fend off this attacker. Working with individuals who have religious beliefs that don't existence or identity of trans individuals is very important as well. Lamia spoke earlier about individuals who have lived or choose to live a stealth life, but they don't want to be seen as, I'm a trans woman. They are a woman. So to be outed in that way is something they may not want to do, so they may not report when they have been victimized. Do you want to add any, Lamia, to some barriers that people have to seeking safety and support?
No, I think that you summed it up pretty well. I'm just really happy that here in Albany we had an opportunity to go into our local police stations and provide training to law enforcement, and the reception that we got was pretty good. Also, last year, we learned of our first trans identified police officer will be coming through Albany, and she successfully went through the academy and started working for our local police department. She hurt herself and is currently going back through training and will be joining us within the near future. But it's really great to have a trans police officer on the force, and we were able to see ourselves, and she's really working towards being a liaison for our community between police enforcement and the community. So we're doing great things here in Albany. We just have to continue to be open ourselves and also continue to educate people about the lives of transgender people.
So some of the additional barriers that impact trans individuals, not just as it relates to sexual assault and violence, but in society in general, is economic marginalization, social marginalization, that fear of rejection by family, employer, religious institutions, etc., and then program services responders enforcing binary spaces. So male, female, and they're not seeing trans individuals falling inside of that binary. So they're excluding them from services or forcing them to take services that may not be geared towards their gender identity. So when we look at some of these barriers, Lamia will elaborate on some of the barriers that we have here on the screen.
So as we talked about economic marginalization, when it comes to the economics of a life of a transgender individual, predominantly trans women are 4 times more likely to live in poverty with a household income less than $10,000. And some people might say, why is that? Because in New York State, we still not have yet passed GENDA, which is the Gender Expression Non-Discriminatory Act. And because of that, a lot of people up until recent were not able to access services to have the gender marker change, to get a name change, so that their name and identity can reflect the gender that they're projecting to the outside. So a lot of women and some men do fall into underground economics. They fall into sex work, entrepreneurship, as we like to call it, because we are sex positive here with the education and prevention that we do. So we don't see that as a negative, but a lot of people do fall into underground economics, and for that reason alone, the income levels are just not where it needs to be. And a lot of people have fear and stigma because of transphobia, homophobia. People are not willing, do not feel comfortable being their authentic self and simply applying for like a job. People say, well, you can work at McDonald's. It's really not that simple. It's not that easy when it comes with the trauma that people experience because of how they've been treated because of that identity. So it can be a bit challenging. Another challenge is criminalization, which was so crazy a couple of years ago down in New York City. We had police officers that were rounding trans women up just because they were walking in the village because it was the area that was known for prostitution. So if a woman had a condom in her pocketbook, she was getting pulled over and harassed by police officers because of, just being profiled, and that's just so crazy. So now you can't even be a trans woman and have condoms in your pocketbook. You might be going out for the night, on a date, or whatever the case might be, but they're being criminalized. And another flip side to that is when we have our trans men and women being incarcerated, trans women are targets in several large cities and used in the presence of in several large cities. And when they get incarcerated, that puts them at a higher risk for HIV because victims are usually sexually assaulted by the inmates and by the correctional officers, and they don't feel comfortable sharing their stories, so they suffer in silence. And so that's something that we have to look at as well as a challenge. And last but not least, another challenge when it comes to the medical, we have doctors that lack competency as it relates to trans-specific services. We have limited access to care, and we don't feel safe when we go into environments with doctors. We don't feel that they are inclusive to the trans identities and understanding what it is to be a trans person living in this day and time. And so thankfully in New York, our current administration has made sure that transgender health care is no longer looked at as an elective, but has been put into policy that these services need to be taken care of for trans individuals. As you have known, it's been a great uptake, which no longer is a barrier, but when it comes to receiving health care services, we're now able to do that with some level of competency. And I like to put a plug in for Planned Parenthood. They've been really good when it comes to working with trans communities. So,
and I'll say that even with the benefits of the progress we've made in medically, there's still many challenges. Like I said, these issues cannot be spoken of in a sweeping way. We know, because we serve 7 counties, that we serve rural and urban counties. We have counties where individuals have to, take a bus an hour or to drive an hour to get certain services. So we know that there has been an increase in access for many members of the trans community, but there's still a long way to go for universal access to treatments. And as Amia stated, we don't have GENDA, which is, like you said, the Gender Expression Non-Discrimination Act. We do have SONDA, which is the Sexual Orientation Non-Discrimination Act, which allows, which prohibits, should I say, discrimination in areas of public accommodation, housing, schools, banks, loans. It just says, it's basically saying it's illegal to discriminate against people based on their sexual orientation. Our trans brothers and sisters don't have that same explicit protections in the law. There's things that you can wordsmith and include members of the trans communities in, but there's no explicit protections for trans individuals in those areas. So they are oftentimes, many of them or some of them are underrepresented and or forced to not live their authentic lives. And like the employment thing Lamia was talking about, we had several clients who have said, my job will not let me, my license when I applied said Mark, I identify as Maria, I present myself in feminine ways, but my job has told me I need to come in as Mark or I'm fired. And some have chosen to stay in those professions because they need to make money and live, and some, as Lamia said, have decided to take an entrepreneurial route and engage in sex work and other economics to help them survive. And we also know that at times engaging in sex work and other activities can put you at increased risk for sexual assault and other forms of violence. So we do work from that harm reduction, empowering way to say we're not going to tell you how to live and what to do with your body and yourself, but if you're going to do these things, how can we work to try to minimize harm, to increase safety and access and protection. So we work with our communities in that way. Some more stats. The U.S. The National Center for Transgender Equality did a 2015 U.S. trans survey, and out of that survey, it identified 29% of transgender people living in poverty, compared to 14% of our general population living in poverty. 30% of trans people reported being homeless at some point in their lives, with 12% saying it was within that past year.
Okay, and transgender people experience unemployment at a 3 times rate of the general population, with the rate of people of color up by 4 times the national unemployment rate, which is astonishing. 30% of people reporting being fired, denied a promotion, and or experiencing mistreatment in the workplace due to their gender identity in the 12 months. And once again, we just spoke about gender. We had gender pass. Situations like this will not be acceptable, will not be allowed to happen. 31% of transgender people experienced mistreatment in the past year in a place of public accommodations, i.e. restrooms, restaurants. We have this new religious freedom sweep trying to cross the nation. Hopefully that doesn't, take really hold, because we really see discrimination across the board when we talk about public accommodations. Also including 14% who were denied equal service. We just talked about that. 24% who were verbally harassed, and 2% were physically attacked because of them being transgender.
And we had locally, even recently in the last year, a local trans woman who was assaulted in broad daylight in the middle of a busy intersection at a bus stop with several individuals standing at the bus stop. People ridiculed her for her identity and then physically assaulted her and then kept it moving. And there was little to no response from individuals who witnessed it, which was very problematic. It did make, local news, and we addressed it here locally with Lamia as our trans advocate partnership with the Pride Center of the Capital Region. They hosted a multi-session transgender and gender nonconforming self-defense course where they allowed individuals to come in and provide tools to empower trans individuals to protect themselves, to work with harm reduction tools and techniques, and address feelings of self-worth and inadequacy, because that's very traumatic, not just for the individual who had to go through that, but also to the community at large, that impacts them by saying people don't matter. I don't matter to people. A group of people can sit there and watch me be ridiculed because of my identity and then be physically assaulted and not respond. That impacts people's feelings of self-worth and worthiness, and then it impacts how they navigate through the world and how they may interact with individuals that they come in contact with, including providers and first responders. So it's very important to kind of recognize some of those challenges and barriers that we have.
And something that we also see that's not really talked about, we just celebrated Transgender Day of Remembrance, which was November 20th, when we had people come on. We often talk about people that have lost their lives to murder. But what's also a shocking and surprising statistic is that 40% of transgender individuals that have been surveyed have attempted suicide in their lifetime. That's 9 times the attempt suicide rate in the United States, which is 4.6. So a lot of people, they suffer in silence, and people are just not getting murdered, but people are taking their own lives because they feel that the barriers and the challenges that they're facing is so overwhelming that they don't even want to be here anymore because they lack the support that they need, and they feel like they're all alone. So that's also something that people need to keep in mind when we talk about dealing with the transgender population and some barriers that they face.
Exactly. So one of the things that we work to do is we work to be strength-based. We identify problems and challenges, and then we meet them head on. So one of the things we want to transition to is creating affirming spaces. So the question that we pose to those in attendance is, what are some things you can do at your organization to provide affirming and safe spaces for trans individuals? So we'll give you a minute or two to think of some responses, and then type them into the chat box. What are some things you can do at your organization to provide affirming and safe spaces for trans individuals? Okay, so some responses are coming in. We encourage you all to participate. And, well, we have put a rainbow on our door, which is visible signs of support, posting a flyer indicating we are a safe space and our staff attend safe space training. Ask clients for their preferred pronouns upon meeting them, which is important. All of them are important, but that one is standing out because request/promote training for all staff. Ask clients what their gender is. So how many of you on the call, how many of your organizations collect data on gender identity? And if you could just put yes or no. So we have some yes, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 yeses, a couple of no's. And when we say that when you collect it, we want to know if it's institutionalized. So if it's on your data collection forms, because we know that some places we work with some of the well-knowing and well-meaning workers and advocates will ask the question, but it's not anything that's institutionalized and the information doesn't go anywhere. So I'm very happy to see several yeses and individuals who still have some work that needs to be done in being inclusive. And then we report to OBS female, male, other. And that's also one of the things that we are working on at In Our Voices is challenging funders who are now requiring, information on sexual orientation, gender identity to be, let me backtrack. They're requiring that agencies that are serving victims serve equally and equitably individuals regardless of their gender identity or sexual orientation. However, in their data collection, they're not comprehensively asking for that information. So to have other as an option is not oftentimes inclusive to individuals. It is not an inclusive. So we advocate for the explicit, space that will say transgender, male, female, intersex, like whatever you want to put, but just to make sure that it's more options than just an other, because other can mean anything for some people. So it's important to kind of challenge from all levels, and that's why we mentioned the work that we do at In Our Own Voices. We do it individually, community-based, and systems level. So we've been working or trying to work with some funders to make sure that they're creating spaces for us to explicitly collect that information as well. And even if funders aren't requiring it, providing organizations with tools in which they can capture that information themselves for their own internal work. Because one of the things that we know is that data impacts policies, it impacts programs, it leads to program enhancements. It dictates the services and training needs, because some people mentioned training was needed for their staff. So we need to be able to collect this data, and so we can know how to effectively utilize it and best serve victims and survivors. So it's very important to have that space as well, because it makes people feel included and that they matter, to have their identities represented on intake or in the interactions. Some other ones we said, once again, was the visible signs of support. So someone mentioned putting a rainbow on the door, and one of the things that we talk about is it has to be a multifaceted approach, because if you're putting the rainbow on the door but the staff aren't trained, it's setting people up for failure and re-victimization, because they're going to say, oh, this is a safe space for me, I see the rainbow, and come in, and then they're getting dirty looks from the staff, or the staff don't know where to direct them because they're trans. So making sure that the rainbow is one factor, one component of a larger agency assessment and training initiative. So thank you all for your contributions on there. So once you identify some of the things that, some of the ways you can create safe and affirming spaces, What are some potential challenges and roadblocks to creating these safe and affirming spaces? So, because if it was just that easy, we would all be doing it. So what are some potential challenges and roadblocks do individuals foresee for making those changes or creating fully inclusive services? Ignorance and prejudice, yes, huge. Not portraying an inclusive staff, meaning race, ethnicity, gender, or orientation. Other people who do not accept transgender individuals. And you can keep on typing in out isolation from your peers, the lack of the proper language. These are all important, and they all come with not enough research on best practices, and these are all very important things to highlight. Your hiring practices at your organizations, these are really your priorities as well. The trans community represents a small, quote-unquote, a small portion of the population statistically, but it does not mean that they don't matter and that their needs are not to be addressed or prioritized as other victims or survivors. It makes, some people say, making clients feel that they are being profiled. Some feel that this issue is not a priority. As staff, you can make them feel accepted, but other clients make them feel uncomfortable. Yes. So one of the things that we talk about in addressing some of those roadblocks is that you all listed is with that training and technical assistance, reaching out to community organizations that provide, like In Our Own Voices, that provide trainings around how to get your agency where it needs to be, because we do see people where staff may not feel comfortable. They may not feel comfortable with language. They may not feel comfortable. They don't want to quote unquote offend people. So one of the things is we do provide little sample templates that they can utilize. So here at X, Y, and Z agency, we serve everyone, regardless of sexual orientation, gender identity, race, So these questions that we're asking you, we ask of all of our clients to make sure we can get you the best possible resources that are available to you. Because what we notice is that being a part of the LGBT community and then also being a part of the LGBT community and also part of the trans community is that some of our resources are limited. But on the flip side, you may have access to additional resources. So it's important that you know that and note that, because In Our Own Voices, we're a culturally specific organization. So your agency may not have the same services that we have. So you have an additional resource in us that you can utilize. So being able to get all that information will help you best serve the individuals as well. I see some more popping up. And I said that one just where it says making sure the clients feel like they're being profiled, so that you let them know that we're asking everyone these questions, not individuals we just think that might be trans or we think might be lesbian or gay, because that's what happens with a lot of the trainings we do, that people say, oh, I think I served a lesbian last year, or I ask if I think that they are, and not a sweeping institutional process of collecting this information. So it's definitely important. Yep, and then someone says living and working in a rural community where resources are not available locally. And that's important as well. As I mentioned before, we serve rural and urban areas. So one of the things that we are able to do at In Our Own Voices, we are able to travel to the areas and serve individuals, but we do also live in a digital age. And we know that all people don't have access to technology, but more and more people do. And there's many online forums, there are online support groups, there's video and telephone trans support groups that are available, that individuals who are isolated by geography can call in and speak to other individuals about their experiences, about their challenges and identities as well. So it's a part of doing the research to identify, if I don't have it, where can they go? Is there smartphone apps, which there are smartphone apps? Are there video support groups? Are there online support groups, which there are? So it's doing that additional research as well. And when you're in a rural community that trans communities is not as accepted, to be able to provide that harm reduction information to the individual that you're serving, to be able to say, we live in our areas not as accepting. What are some things that you can do to still be safe? What are some things you can do to still affirm your identity and still be okay? Sometimes it's not safe for individuals to come out and as a trans person. So that it doesn't mean that they're not trans and they can't live their life. It just means that they have additional challenges and barriers. So an example I give it's not the same, but it's a similar example, is prior to working at In Our Own Voices, I was a resident director at a college, a university. And I had students who came out to me as a part of the LGBT community and were very excited about, I feel comfortable. I thought I was alone. I thought I was the only one. I realized, I'm not alone. And when I go back home for, Christmas break or summer break, I'm coming out to my parents. And one of the things I would talk to them and do with them is similar to what we do with victims of sexual violence and domestic violence, is safety plan. And say, okay, so if you came out to your family, what are some potential consequences? If they told you, you know what, don't come home, do you have a safe space to go? Because the dorms are closing and no one can stay on the campus. So if you do come out and they tell you not to come home, what would you do? You need to identify a safe space, a family or friend that you can stay with. If your parents are paying your tuition or your car note or any financial obligations or ties, and they say, we're cutting you off because of your identity, what backup do you have? And working with so it came for some of the youth or individuals I was working with, they said, okay, it's not the time for me to come out right now. I need to shore up my resources, apply, do you want to apply for some grants? Do you want to get a second job to save up money? So if they do, cut ties, that you're able to be okay and self-sufficient, at least monetarily. And so some individuals chose to come out and still live their authentic self, and some say, well, you know what, maybe right now is not the time for me to come out. And so I think of some other things. So that is some things that you can do with individuals who are living in areas that are more hostile or not as safe for members of the trans community. It still provides them with affirmation, let them know that they matter, let them know that you're there for them and you see them, and give them some harm reduction tools and techniques to hopefully better navigate an unfair and unfriendly society.
Okay, let's talk about some promising practices, which is always fun. This is some things that we can do, keep in mind as we're working with our transgender population, using gender-neutral terms. Do not let personal phobias, isms, and privilege dictate their interaction, which is really important. Having awareness of local resources if further assessment is needed. Having visible signs of support, as someone stated earlier, with like the rainbow flag or even the trans flag. Conducting regular organizational assessments to ensure that your organization and staff policies are culturally aware and affirming and relative. And all these things collectively is a good way to start. If you're unsure about someone's how they identify, you can ask them what their pronouns are. And now we're seeing a lot of gender nonconforming individuals, so it's more so appropriate now, more so than ever, to ask them, what are the pronouns? How do you identify? She, hers, hers, him, his, him, or they, them, theirs, are the pronouns in which you can ask. And so when you're using gender-neutral terms, you can kind of ask that question, what are your pronouns, and that can kind of help you get around that, and not just saying, not being binary when it comes to your gender terminology. Some people, we have our no one's perfect, but do not let personal biases or isms and privilege dictate your interaction. We usually, in our in person, we do a cisgender privilege activity, and we realize by doing the activity, a lot of people don't realize the privileges that they hold. like when you're going to a family gathering, you don't have to worry about is someone going to ask you about your gender identity? When you're out in public, you don't have to worry about what bathroom are you going to be able to use when you're out, or do you have to wait until you get back to your safety area to be able to use the restroom, or just have interactions with the general public. And that's a privilege that a lot of us hold, that some trans individuals that they simply do not have, and they live in fear and anxiety. Just to have interactions with other individuals can be really scary and terrifying for them, and be re-traumatizing in some instances. Having awareness of your local resources. So even by being on this webinar today, you are being aware of In-On Voice. If you didn't know about In-On Voices, we have other LGBT centers up here, such as the Pride Center and other agencies that are LGBT friendly. So just being aware of where you are and what organizations are around you, and what the organizations do, and how they can assist the LGBT community, especially working with trans individuals. Visible signs of support. Someone mentioned earlier the rainbow flag, also the trans flag, which is blue, white, and pink. That's also great representation. Also, when it comes to if you have stock images, having pictures of trans individuals in your facilities as well is something that's good. Having literature that talks about trans issues, trans successes and challenges will also be something that's good, just to have visible in your respective places of work. And then when it comes to your organization, starting from the head on down to throughout the staff, just being able and being open to have people come in and do technical support trainings and trainings that are specific to dealing with trans populations. And it's not always so good just to have the entry-level staff trained, but everyone trained from the top on down. That would be something that would be really good and be competent for the organization to do. So culturally awareness and affirming and relevant.
Right, and that's important. I think we talk about the trainings, and we oftentimes may have a program director or an executive director or a staff say, oh, can you come in and train us? And they only want the staff that are engaging with the client to do the training. And I say, no, if we want all levels of the organization to be involved in that training, even down to, whenever possible, the janitorial staff, volunteers, because everyone needs to be aware. It can't just be the individual that you're going to be working one-on-one with, the client will be working one-on-one with, because the client is still encountering the rest of the staff and the rest of the team while they're in your agency. They're walking past the janitorial staff. They're walking past or engaging with the hello or whatever with other people that are in your agency. So if that person or people are biased, have their own personal isms and phobias, and they're giving a dirty look, or they're whispering and talking, in an area, I think they might be a quote-unquote a man, or I think they might be a woman. Those things are all things that people encounter over here, see, and have reported back to us. I'm not going back to this agency because I heard them asking, what is that? You know what I mean? So it's very important to really realize that it needs to be across the board training whenever possible. And we do have some agencies who have said to us, we want our janitorial staff trained. We want our, volunteers trained. We want board members to come to this training. And we're like, yes. We as many people to have access to the information, the better. So it's definitely important. And we do come in and we do provide additional training on organizational assessment. So it's looking at policies and procedures. It's looking at organizational culture. So internal staffing and what is the culture of your agency. It's looking at materials, like Lamia was saying. How are your materials depicting the diversity that's supposed to exist? And also, how do you build rapport with individuals who may not identify as you do? Like In-On Voices, we're a culturally specific organization, which means that we're comprised, our staff, our board, our volunteers are primarily comprised of the community that we're serving. So we're an LGBT organization with a focus on communities of color. The majority of our staff are LGBT people of color. Majority of our board identify as LGBT people of color, a lot of our volunteers, and a lot of our clients. However, we have white staff, we have heterosexual staff, but the majority of our makeup is the communities that we serve. So what we recognize through our own needs assessments and studies is that our communities who don't access In Our Voices, who are engaging with other organizations, are not seeing themselves reflected. So if I'm a young black gay male who is working with, all of my providers are primarily older white heterosexual women, you know, how are we equipping them with the tools that they need to provide costly relevant services, because they can't provide the same costly specific services in a way that In Our Voices can do it, but it doesn't mean that there cannot be a connection, that the person and the individual cannot have rapport and cannot open up. But it's creating that safe space for them to bring their whole self to the encounter, and part of that starts with the education and awareness, kind of what people are doing today. Same thing with nurses. I know some people here from the medical field. We train SANE nurses. Lamia and I will be training some SANE nurses on Monday on just that rapport building. And you can use medical terms, but it's just making sure you're equipped, because we did see a lot of people discouraged at the way they were treated by nurses and medical staff who were not trans aware or trans friendly or able to provide affirming services. They provided the services. They went through the steps that they were supposed to do, but they didn't do it in a way that was affirming to the victim of assault. And so that person felt victimized. They felt that they weren't seen, and they were treated like a piece of property and not a person. So we're trying to provide the tools to combat that as well. So I think that's what we have right now as far as the content that we wanted to cover in the time that we had. Are there any questions from individuals or points that people want to, ask or discuss, or any commentary that you may be doing in your own agencies, or things you want to add to the conversation? And we'll give a couple minutes for people to get their thoughts together. One of the questions we have is, what is the best way on a client intake to assess if an individual is trans? What questions to ask or how to phrase them? One of the things that we do at In Our Own Voices, even though we are a culturally specific organization, we try not to do check boxes, because we realize that someone could be easily not included. So we have our general intake, the ones that our funders ask for, but and we created our own intake. It's called the Client Self-Report Form. And on the Client Self-Report Form, it's just blank lines. So we say legal name, preferred name, sex, gender identity, sexual orientation, and we have blank lines that we have, and they self-disclose how they identify. So that's the way that we do it. Sometimes individuals will leave that blank because some of them have not met us before, so they may not feel comfortable and safe. Even though we are a culturally specific organization, they still may not feel safe disclosing. So what we do is they fill out the client self-report form with their identity and what they're here for, and then that's done when they arrive at the organization. That form is then given to the individual who will be working with them. We attach it to our traditional intake, and we use that as a guide. Usually individuals may leave that blank, but then in the rapport building, once they talk to us and go through the intake process, then they'll be like, oh, I left that blank. Or it may come out in the conversation how they identify around sexual orientation and gender identity, and then we go and we fill it in after the conversation. So some people do feel uncomfortable asking the question, so we let them self-disclose or self-identify, and then we'll go from there. And like I said, one of the things that also work is giving a disclaimer before. The series of questions that we have to ask you right now, we ask of all individuals. We want you to know that we serve all individuals regardless of sexual orientation, gender identity, race, belief system, religion, etc. So anybody that's accessing our services has to be committed to respecting the dignity and common humanity of us all. Something like that. This is a simple, thing that we can do so people don't feel singled out and quote unquote targeted as a member of the LGBT community. Someone else asked, does In Our Own Voices have a website and or a Facebook page? Yes, we have both. Our website is www.inourownvoices.org, and our Facebook is facebook.com/inourOwnVoices. But it will show up as Tangela Grown in Our Own Voices. That's our executive director. It'll show up as Tangela Grown in Our Own Voices, but the name is In Our Own Voices. Facebook/in Our Own Voices. Someone else asked, I work with teens who have varying degrees of resistance or denial by their parent or their transgender, a parent of their transgender or sexual orientation. Any advice about what approach with them is appreciated? So, I'm going to see if I'm reading the next question. I want to see if anyone else who has worked with the community has any response to Lynn's question that they have utilized or that they would suggest. It says, I work with teens who have varying degrees of resistance or denial by their parent of their transgender or sexual orientation. Any advice on how to approach with them is appreciated. So someone mentioned affirming and validating the teen's experiences and feelings, and that's what we do. We work from where individuals are, and we do a lot of safety planning. And this kind of goes in alignment with the next question from Cheyenne, which it says, I have crossed paths with individuals in a group who feel, quote-unquote, forced to accept culture they do not feel comfortable with. I tend to guide them to have a neutral perspective, but they insist that being neutral goes against who they are. Is it wrong to convince them otherwise, even if the goal is to create a more inclusive space? So that what we do is we validate everyone's individual belief systems and their identities. When we do our trainings, we are not saying that everyone has. We know we do not live in a utopian society, so we do not want to pretend that everyone's going to be robotic and like each other and accept each other. We're not asking that. We're asking to be treated with dignity and respect. We're not asking for special treatment. We're asking for equitable treatment. So when we talk to organizations about being inclusive, it's not saying to give us special treatment and give us a pass. No, it's saying if you're housing women who are victims of domestic violence, then you should be housing gay men or men and trans individuals as well for an equitable society, whether you agree with it or not. Some organizations that we work with, when they began to become inclusive, some of their staff members didn't want to go with that change. They saw violence as something that impacted women. They saw that they could not fathom a male being a victim of a crime, as whether that's sexual assault, domestic violence. So the organizations had the buy-in to say, this is the direction that we're going in. If you cannot get on board with that direction, then this may not be the agency for you. It's not saying that you have to, like LGBT individuals or even understand our experiences or existence, but you need to be treating everyone with dignity and respect. Same thing when we talk to law enforcement officers. The motto is traditionally to protect and to serve. It's to protect and to serve all, not to protect and to serve the individuals that you like or agree with or understand. You're supposed to provide equitable services to increase the safety of individuals that you're working with or that you're encountering in society. So it's not forcing. Like, we don't work to force anything. We work to educate and to advocate for treating our communities with dignity and respect. And then it says, generally teens have problems being accepted by their parents and peers. This is a complex question. How would help any teen going through identity issues? And that's the biggest thing. That's a big thing as well. Looking at where we are as, well, I'm not a teen anymore. It's been a while, but I still struggle with identity issues as well. But yeah, like I said, our biggest thing is affirming where individuals are, letting them know that we do not live in a society that is going to be open arms and accepting, but how can you still walk through the world with your head high, with dignity and respect, even when you're confronted with challenges on a daily basis, whether that's family, friends. You can't change people's, you can't immediately, I feel, change people's hearts and minds. It takes time, and some minds or hearts will never change. But you still are here, and you matter, and you still need to navigate through this world. Your life doesn't stop if a family member or friend or, institution cuts you off. It may feel like it does, but it doesn't. So what can you do to move on and carry on in hopes that they will eventually come around? If they don't, how do you still be okay with who you are? So it is very complex and nuanced. There's no real advice that you can give because it's all individual. But the common themes is affirming people's identities and belief systems, letting them know that they do matter, and helping them navigate through the world that has been unfavorable to them. And then it says parents may need help to understand the normalcy of their transgender children because initially it may all be new and scary. And that's real. That's real around everything, around sexual orientation, around gender identity. It is scary for parents and individuals sometimes because it's a safety issue. People see how trans individuals are treated and LGBT individuals are treated. They're subject to harassment. They're subject to legislation. People have to vote on if we're whole human beings, if we deserve to be, if we're able to marry the person that we love, two consensual adults choosing to live their life together. That has to be voted on by people. You know what I mean? So imagine that. So it is scary if our communities are disproportionately impacted by hate violence. So parents may not want their child to go through that, and they want to say, oh, it's a phase, or So it's coming from a real place. And what we're seeing now is children are starting to identify as trans as early as 4 and 5 years old. And I know Barbara Walters did a study or a special on it a couple of years ago, highlighting parents' struggles with that, the fear, what are the next steps? Is this just the phase? They tracked trans youth over a number of years to see, how they began to grow, what things that were offered, what options were offered to them. So it is something that's emerging and becoming more brought to the forefront because trans individuals have been here since the dawn of time. It's not a new phenomenon because Caitlyn Jenner decided to say, "Call me Kate." These communities have always been here, but they've been pushed into conforming or been made to be invisible, kind of we were talking about at the beginning of the presentation around this binary that we set up as a society. If you don't fall in that, then you're either othered, made to feel invisible, or you're subject to, harassment and physical, violence. So it's just important to recognize that as well. And then somebody said, I would say education for parents and teens, more awareness. So that's also the case. If parents are struggling, You can provide the parents with resources, whether that's, like I said, online, whether that's pamphlets, how to understand what my children are going through. Because for some parents, it's a loss for them. So if they've raised and they feel like they've birthed a child of a certain sex or gender, and then that child comes to them at a certain age and says, no, this is who I am, that they have to mourn and grieve that as well, because they have memories of a young boy that they have had and raised who is identifying as a female. So even parents who accept their child's gender identity still struggle with that. When you look back at family photos, the photos are not matching how the child or how the individual is now. So there is going to be some complexities to this. It's not an exact science. It's going to be some nuances that have to be, addressed. And let me see. Okay. Any more questions or comments? I'm hoping that we got to everyone's questions that who put a question on there. I'm going back to look. I think we addressed them all. But if I didn't, or if we didn't, please add the question now. Or if you have anything else you want to add, you can do so. It's right now 11:42, so we'll give until 11:45 for individuals to ask any more questions or ask for clarity, and then we will end 15 minutes early. We put our contact information up. Lamia's email address and my email address are there, along with In Our Own Voices address and website. So you can obtain information that way as well. So there's no more questions. So we want to thank you all for joining us today. As I mentioned, this is a foundational training with a little bit more information thrown in, but it basically is intended to be a foundational training, and hopes that you will all take this back to your respective agencies and organizations, as well as into your communities. So, because this goes way beyond work. This is life. This is the society that we live in, and we want people to be informed and aware, so that you can be effective advocates for individuals who may not be at the power tables, who may not be, whose voices may not be able to be heard or be present. To utilize your privilege, as Lamia was saying earlier, to recognize your privilege, what social position you have, and how do you use that to increase access to individuals who don't have access, to increase equity in our society. That's a very important piece that I think many people need to recognize, because privilege is not a positive or a negative term. It's nothing you should feel guilty about. It's what people do with their power and privilege that make it a positive or a negative. So if I know that I have able-bodied privilege, I can navigate through spaces in a different way than some individuals that may have mobility issues or have a wheelchair. I'm not going to plan conferences and trainings in places that are not accessible. I'm utilizing my able-bodied privilege to make sure I'm being a voice for those who may not have that same access. So it's the same way with working with other marginalized groups like trans individuals, LGBT individuals, is to create that space for them. If policies are being developed that may not be inclusive, if things are being said that may not be inclusive or affirming, to be able to use our privilege to challenge that and offer alternatives. So those are kind of the takeaways we wanted to make sure that individuals received. And if you need us for more training and technical assistance, like I said, our information is there, and you can also reach out to other organizations around the country that are doing similar work. So thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Phil. Thank you, Lamia. And thank you all for your participation today.
Yes.
Okay, great. Well, that ends our webinar. Thanks again.
Everyone have a great day. Thank you.
Everybody have a great one. Take care.
All righty. Bye-bye.